Good morning. Thank you for joining us for today's coffee talk. My name is Sean O'Brien, president of Quick Rate. And as always, I'm pleased to be joined by Steve Huntington. Steve, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks again for joining us this Friday. My name is Steve Huntington. I'm Director of Analytics here at Quick Analytics. I spent my entire career working with community financial institutions and spent a little over a decade now working with Sean.
Thank you, Steve. And welcoming back our dear friend Paul Allen from Saltmarsh. We're thrilled to have Paul join us today. Paul, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Thank you, Sean, and thank you, Steve and Sean, for letting me join you in the conversation. My name's Paul Allen. I work with Saltmarsh, Cleveland, and Gund, and get the opportunity to work with credit unions and financial institutions all over the place and hear what's on their mind and what their problems are. So enjoy the conversation. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Thank you. Just a little bit of information about Paul's firm, Saltmarsh. Okay, just a reminder, if you want to chat or ask a question, just hit it through the chat feature of the Q&A box. We'll monitor those throughout the presentation today. We'll take those either in the midst of the conversation or an appropriate break or at the end of today's discussion. We do have a couple of polling questions to get us started again. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that. And then just a reminder, we will send out a link to the recording today, as well as a copy of all the slides. So got a few polling questions here today. First one, have you seen any increase in your past due loans this year? A simple yes or no. And then secondly, if yes, which category of loans increased the most? I probably should have added auto and consumer on this one, so I apologize for that. But if you want to go ahead and just click on those, that'd be great. All right, we'll go ahead and end this one, share the results. So 84% of you have seen an increase in your past dues. And again, we probably should have had consumer and auto on there. I apologize. So not much from, oh, there we go, 89%. It was there. I didn't see it. Yeah, 89%. So primarily focused on the consumer. So thank you very much. I got to learn how to scroll better here. Let's see, just the increase in loans. Have you seen your loans increase or decrease this year? Or stay the same as the third option. We'll give this one 30 seconds or so. We'll go ahead and end that one and share the results. So 38% of you have seen an increase, 38% have seen decrease, and 25% about the same. So thank you again. Let's move on to the next question. ACL change. Has your allowance for credit losses increased, decreased, or stayed the same this year? We'll just give this 30 seconds. Right. Share those. 58% of you have seen an increase, 13% have decreased, and 29% have stayed. Do you anticipate increasing your reserve this year? Just a yes, no, or undecided are our options here. Oops. 60% of you do anticipate an increase, 23% are undecided, and 17% don't anticipate an increase. So again, let me share those so you can see them. And we will move on to the next question regarding unfunded commitments. Do you currently have an amount reserved for unfunded commitments? Just a yes or no here. %72% of you do, and 28% no. So that's good. Thank you. Let me stop that one, and we'll get to our final question, just around model validation. Has your financial institution had a CECL model validation perform yet? Again, just a yes or no option. %69% of you have not, and 31% of you have. So again, thank you very much for taking part and sharing your responses here on those polling questions. We do much appreciate it. We will include it in the email that'll probably come Monday afternoon, with again, a link to the slides and a link to the recording for today. As we always do, we just always want to continually remind you of the updates and enhancements that we continue to make. Steve's going to talk about a new one that I think many of you will appreciate if you have us calculate your WARMs. I think it's always important to remember these are optional. They are designed to try to make your experience with CECLSolver more seamless. And so if there are ways that we can bring additional functionality, make your work a little bit easier, provide more information or context. Really, those are some of the main objectives we have in our mind as we think about additional tools or functionality. They typically never will impact the calculation. It's all designed around your user experience and trying to improve that. We do have a couple of just a couple of chats. So I'm glad. Thank you for utilizing that. I'm going to move to the next slide and let Steve talk to you about this most recent enhancement, the warm values import. So Steve, take it away.
Yeah, so like with a lot of our tools and enhancements that we've made to the CECLSolver over the last couple of years, this has come as a direct result of feedback that we've gotten from our users. So please keep it coming. A lot of our users have us calculate their WARMs. So if we're calculating your WARMs for you, meaning that you're sending us your loan level data on an ongoing basis, and we're calculating the WARMs for you and providing different WARM values depending upon which methodology of a couple options that you have. A lot of our users asked if there was a way that we could have the results of the WARM calculations automatically imported into the tool so they didn't have to plug them in kind of manually each time. And we took that to heart. And so what we have done is for all of our users that do where we do your WARM calculations for you, each time we do a WARM calculation, you'll be able to access it directly in the tool. And even for all of our users that do not, where we're not calculating WARMs, if you kind of want to get a head start using the tool and have some industry data that's used to give you some industry default kind of peer-based averages for WARMs, coming directly from the NCUA or coming directly from all of our internal user scenarios that have been run over the last couple of years, you'll have a couple options for that. So if you go to the next slide, you can see how that's going to work. It's not live yet. It will be live, not this coming Monday, but a week from Monday. And there'll just be a new green button right at the top of the WARM column. And if you click on that, then you'll be able to choose if we're running your WARMs for you, you'll be able to choose a couple different methodologies. The two primary methodologies where the more conservative methodology where we're adjusting just for prepayments, leading to kind of higher WARM levels, or the option where we're adjusting for amortization and taking that into account as well. You'll be able to choose one of those methodologies, and then you'll be able to choose whatever date that your data is as of from the last time you sent it to us. If you're sending us the data on a quarterly basis, each time we finish the process, we'll plug it in here. And so at some point, you'll have a running list, the drop-down box of all the times that we've calculated your WARMs. And so if you needed to go back in time and run a scenario from the end of last year, for example, as long as we've calculated a WARM for you as of then, you'll be able to go back and pull those up. For our users that were not calculating the warms, you'll still have two peer-based options. The first peer-based warm option gets that data directly from the NCUA. So for those of you who are not familiar, every quarter the NCUA does or updates a study that they have done where they get loan level data from smaller credit unions from around the country and calculate warms and prepayment assumptions by loan segment for all the call report segments as sort of a starting point or peer-based default warm value that can that translates perfectly into our tool. That is an option, and that'll be done quarterly. So you'll be able to choose any quarter, March 31st, end of last year, etc. The other option is based upon the thousands of user scenarios that our users have run using our CECLSolver tool. And so we took all that data and we organized it by segment as well. So if you want to see another peer-based value for your warms, you can choose that as an option. And if you're just curious as to what some of the warms are for industry data and peer data and want to compare that to your own warms if you're calculating them or to our warms, you can do that very easily using this by just clicking on the pre-populate tool and choosing a methodology and a date, and it'll show you what those warm values are, whether it's a kind of a double check to make sure, give you more confidence that you're calculating the warms using an appropriate methodology or kind of your assumptions are in line or in check with the industry. You'll have a couple options for that as well. So hopefully that's something that many of you utilize. And
yeah, Steve, that's a great tool from an auditor perspective or for management. One of the concepts in model validation and monitoring is to, at least annually analyze your key assumptions. And obviously the warm assumption is if not the most important assumption, it's certainly one of them. So it is very helpful if you're using your actual data to perhaps once a year or periodically compare that to peer and see if you're pretty consistent. If you're not consistent, is there a rational logic behind that? Can you explain that? So would encourage people to use those tools as an alternative source of information and to compare those and to periodically show those to the board or the supervisory committee so that the governance committee can see that management is coming up with assumptions, and those assumptions are falling within a reasonable range of peer data. So that's a very good tool, and very nice the way that you've got actual in two different ways, with and without amortization, and then two different sources of peer data.
Yep. And so a couple of questions have come in, Steve. Okay, so can we use this even if we compute our own warm using the spreadsheet provided?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No.
They'll see the peer ones.
Well, yeah, the peer ones. So if you're completing your own spreadsheet, we wouldn't have any way to have that data unless you sent it to us. But the process of you emailing that to us so that we can plug those numbers in, we can certainly do that. It might be more hassle than it's worth, for you. But if you'd prefer to have them in this environment, then you can send us those spreadsheets whenever you complete them and ask us to enter it on the back end so that it's available directly in the tool. Yes, we can certainly do that. And if we're not doing your warms for you at all, the two peer-based options will be there for everybody.
Right.
Yeah. But yeah, we can plug those in on the back end for you if it's more efficient and convenient for you.
Yeah, and so the second question is kind of the same thing. How can we view those values without pre-populating? So that, again, the peer-based ones will be there even if we
without the peer-based ones, you can't view them. When you click on them, it will populate the warm values with the peer-based one. So what I would suggest, the easiest thing to do is start a new scenario, right? So you're not messing with any of your existing scenarios. Just click new scenario and then choose one of the peer-based methods, and it'll populate all those warms. and you can see what those values are in a kind of a non-saved, historical scenario for your credit union. If you just want a spreadsheet that has the peer-based ones by quarter for a few quarters, I can shoot you an email that has the Excel file in it, but this will be a way that you can get it on an ongoing basis and track it.
And so the question is, when will that import features be available? Steve, I think you said it'll be released after
The plan
next
is
weekend, right?
the plan, mind you, is to be not this weekend but next weekend. So the Monday after next Monday, they should be available. If there's some pressing need that you have to see some of the data, we can certainly get you something quicker. But as far as you being able to do it on an automated basis, it should be the Monday after next. If there's any issues with that, it might get bumped a few days when we do our last minute testing, but I don't anticipate that.
And so then a question came in, what's the best way to back test the model on an annual basis? I'm not sure
we've gotten a lot of different questions about back testing and what that means to different people. And it depends on exactly what that means to you when you say back testing, right? You can one way of back testing is simply you look at a scenario that you built a year ago and compare it to where your losses have been since that time, to test whether when you ran a model a year ago, whether what's happened since then has matched up to the assumptions that you made when you ran it historically. That's a concept around backtesting. If you're talking about more from just validating the historical data to ensure that that all that data is there and is accurate, like the lifetime historical loss rate calculations and whatnot, we have an Excel-based tool that we can send you that does that validates the historical lifetime loss rates by segment for a particular scenario. If you give us your data, that we can turn it around and send that to you. Outside of those two concepts, Paul, you might have some insight into a more technical definition of back testing for this particular purpose.
Yeah, so back testing in a model generally means that you want to compare your actual experience with what you projected it to be. And so in the CECL model, we're projecting losses for a period of time, and we can look at our actual losses during that period of time. So if we had projected that our loss rate for the next quarter or our prepayments on our loans, we can pick a couple of those major assumptions, and we can weight a year out, and we can say, what did we project them to be last year, and what did they actually come in? So it's difficult to back test in concept. Was my reserve exactly appropriate that I projected last year to this year? Well, that reserve now includes some information about the future. So really the more pertinent thing would be, what are the factors that I am projecting forward? Historical loss, and we don't have to test that data. It's actual data. It should be tied directly to your records. So what are we projecting forward that we would back test? Well, the key assumptions would be, what are the losses that I'm projecting over the next year or 2 years? And then look at your actual loss. What was your actual charge-off ratio during that period of time? And then you can look at the major assumption of prepayment and amortization and say, what did I project those loan volumes to be, and what are they really going to be? I think that all of us realize that we're projecting that loans will be with us a certain amount of time, and we don't actually know how long the life of that loan is. So one of the major assumptions would be, did those loans pay off faster or slower than we thought? That means we have that credit risk longer. And then what were the actual charge-offs and recoveries compared to what the model would have assumed them to be for the next year? So typically in this model, we're back testing individual assumptions. And so we're saying which are the key assumptions, then we'll wait a year and look back and see how closely that was. But that's not new, by the way. We do model validation and interest rate risk and liquidity and other areas that we use a model within the bank. So I think that unfortunately there's not a back test button that you get to push and it says everything's okie dokie. You're going to have to pick a couple of things in the model that you're projecting and then look at the actual experience of those individually. I don't think there's a way to just make a conclusion that the reserve was plus or minus 5 basis points perfect. I think we have to look at the assumptions.
Yeah, picking particular assumptions, zeroing in on them and seeing if they in practice were as accurate as they could be with the new data that you've gotten since you made the assumption. I mean, at a very general level, you could also think of it as, well, the final result of using this tool is an ACL calculation. If I have an ACL of 1% using this tool, and my average WARM over the whole portfolio is 4 years, that suggests that I anticipate having total net charge-offs of 1% in aggregate over the next 4 years, plus or minus. If I want to backtest on a year's worth on an annual basis, I might take that, divide it by 4, and say, well, 1% loss is expected over 4 years on the whole portfolio, equates to about 25 basis points in a given year. Has my losses over the last given year been about 25 basis points? I realize that's general level, but I think you'll find most of you, if you do that, a lot of the backtesting is going to suggest that we're over reserved because there are Q factors that have not yet come to pass that drive most of our reserves.
Wait, Steve, I thought we always wanted more reserves. How could we have too much?
Depends on who you ask.
Yeah, so and you've just pointed out the obvious dilemma. Some of our reserve level is for economic factors and considerations and for the relative risk at any point in time in our portfolio. And that's really based on what we think the economic factors would be. So we can look at economic factor assumptions and compare them to what the economy actually did and how that performance. We can look at the estimated life of the loan by looking at prepayments and amortization, projected versus actual. And then finally, we can look at historical losses projected against what we actually had. So it's really looking at those individual factors as opposed to just whether the reserve should have been 121 or 125. It's difficult to say that at any point in time.
Yeah. So Wayne, the follow-up question is, could you lock your final scenario so they're not updated after additional loss ratios are updated? So if the software had locked scenarios and could be compared to the actual loss ratios at the end of the year with your scenario, it'd produce a comparative report.
So it can be compared, and I want to just it's a point of clarification here, and I know what you're talking about, Wayne, or at least I think I know what you're getting at. When you save a scenario, all the data that is used in your actual ACL calculation is locked as of that point in time. If you come back a year from now and open up your scenario from last year, you will see more current. And if you go to the historical table, right, it's going to show all the historical values for losses that have happened since that point in time, but none of them, since your look back periods are locked as of that point in time, none of that data is actually used in your ACL calculation. So the ACL, the scenarios you saved are still historically accurate as of whatever point you saved them. However, when you look at the long-term tables, they will also show more recent data, but it won't be incorporated into the calculation unless and until you roll that data forward. So the reason we didn't completely lock the historical tables in a save scenario was that we wanted it to be easy and intuitive for users to open up an old scenario and then roll it forward. So instead of creating new scenarios each quarter, you'd pull up your old scenario with all your assumptions, your look back periods, your data. Now there's new data available, and you can shift your look back periods to include that new data thereby very easily updating the scenario for the next quarter or the next year. So that's why we chose to do that. I know, so I've had some conversations with auditors where they've been confused because someone's pulled up a scenario 10 months after they built it and then showed that to an auditor, and the auditor says, well, this was as of September 30th of last year. There's a column for 12/31/2023. How could that be? And the answer is that column is there for reference. It's not taken into account in the actual calculations because the look back period is still locked as of when the scenario was saved. I'm getting a little bit technical here. Wayne, I'm happy to, Sean, I'll jump on a call with you and discuss how we can help you compare those two and get to what you're getting on, whether it's in Excel or whether it's doing something else. But I understand your point, and it's well taken.
The next question is, what are some common Q factors being used in this past quarter? I mean, essentially, the Q factors are really there's many from which you can choose from. They're all laid out in the tool. Your ability to use those or rely on those or incorporate those into your own analysis is up to every user. Steve, Paul, anything you want to add there?
As far as which, like, if we're not talking about the level of Q factor adjustment, we're talking about the specific Q factors chosen to be used. That is not something that's new or even different under CECL than it was in the old ALLL methodology, right? We use the interagency guidance from 2004, I believe, which states a list of some of the qualitative factor adjustments which should at least be considered in doing a reserve calculation. And those are the ones that we have by default as options in the tool. Many of them are left blank by most of our users. If you haven't had a significant change in your loan composition or in your underwriting standards or in your management team, Q factor adjustment for those would not be relevant to your institution at this point in time. But everyone is making an economic adjustment of some sort, even if it's they're addressing it, right? It might be an adjustment of 0, but they're addressing economic factors. They're addressing the environment that they're in addition to economic factors, peer data, taking it into account and thinking hard about if you need to make an adjustment based upon the experience of similar institutions around you in your neck of the woods. But beyond that, it's kind of very specific to the institution which other factors are used more frequently.
The next question is, can delinquency data also be incorporated into the software from 5300 call report reporting to show the direction of delinquency to quantify reasoning for Q factor adjustments with ranges of movement of delinquency ratios?
We have some delinquency data. Of course, the same challenge as with the delinquency data is there from the charge-off and recovery data, the complete shifting of all the segments that they're collecting, the buckets and who's in what bucket back in a couple years ago now. But we do have delinquency data in our Excel add-in, and I believe there's some available. Check here. The answer is yes. We've been working on getting additional leading indicators of credit quality and finding ways to try to integrate that either directly into the CECLSolver tool or to some other financial pages where you can track your delinquency rates by segment and your peers with some of the same choices of peer groups and whatnot. So there's a little bit of it available now, depending upon how you're using the tool and if you have access to our add-in tool, and more will be integrating in the future and from directly in the tool perspective. It's a good point.
That's a good question and a good point. Yeah, we'll work on ways to get more of that information in there. All right, so kind of dovetailing the Q factor conversation. Since we have Paul here, we thought we'd let him share some of his thoughts just on this, planning for change and and certainly how that might impact your Q factors going forward. So Paul, I'll let you take it from there.
Well, Sean, as we had been talking earlier, the implementation of CECL has kind of calmed down as people have understood how to put the model in place and so forth. And so we're starting to get, used to using the model and so forth. So looking forward, what are the implementation issues or things that you might want to consider? And one of those is this ongoing conversation that we've had for the last year and a half or so, that there's an expectation that asset quality or credit risk is the big issue around the corner. And so we've had that conversation. We're in an unprecedented historic time where we've had an inverted yield curve for a very long time. We've experienced a lot of suggestions that a recession is coming, but it doesn't show up yet. We just don't see it in the historical. So with that thought process that it's going to turn at some point, and probably sooner rather than later, there's a conversation about the fact that most of our ACL is comprised of qualitative factors that we're just talking about, and very little on actual charge-offs. Now, that may not be quite the experience of all our credit unions out there that have more consumer debt, because the last couple of years we've had the charge-offs in the industry have primarily been in the consumer sector, but now we're looking broader at the rest of the portfolio. So if that's the case, what's the impact on the CECL process? And so I think if we click to the next slide there, we'll just be talking about the fact that there is an expectation from regulators and analysts and auditors that something should be changing, because we know this credit risk is going up. Certainly in the last couple of weeks, we've been hearing a lot about, in the first quarter, a deterioration in some of the credit metrics, delinquencies and so forth, especially in the commercial portfolios. And so, those things, along with what's going on in the economy and an inverted yield curve, which almost always precedes a recession, then there's an expectation that things may change in how we move forward on a quarterly basis looking at CECL. Sean, if you go to the next slide, it just points out, well, we can skip that one. Amazing question. That was just stunning, wasn't it? Just the fact that you might want to go ahead and consider getting started having conversations with your management, your board, your supervisory committee about that. You're probably going to be paying more and more attention to the economic factors, and the sands are shifting. And so really getting clarity around that, we will probably see some changes in that, and probably as we start to have more charge-offs actually occur, there will be a shift from most of our reserve being based on qualitative factors to some or even most of our reserve shifting to historical. Sean, I think a lot of people are sort of thinking that, well, if I start having real losses, that's going to kill me, because heavenly days, I can't reduce the factors I already have, so the historical will just pile on. But that's not the way CECL is supposed to work. CECL is supposed to say that in this time, we're looking forward, expecting those losses, so they're qualitative factors. When we actually start having those losses, well, we probably don't expect that to continue to loom ahead of us. We're actually experiencing it. So we shift some of the reserve when we have more reserve on historical, and we actually see our qualitatives, generally speaking, go down as economic cycles move. So that's probably deserving of some discussion, perhaps some discussion in minutes of committee meetings and so forth. Perhaps just an explanation that once we set the qualitative factors, they're not supposed to stay the same all the time. They're supposed to fluctuate up and down, and that we would expect to see losses going. And unfortunately, we all sort of judge everyone by peer analysis. So, I would be paying attention to media coverage and peer analysis. If the charge-offs aren't happening at your institution, but they're happening all around you, there's probably an expectation that you need to start reserving for that peer experience. It just hasn't hit you yet, but you probably need to be incorporating that in revenue and so forth. In your of the discussion and the narratives. And then that final point, if it were me, I would be walking around a lot around the institution, and I would be talking to my loan folks and my underwriting staff and making sure that as things change economically, a lot of times we change our underwriting standards or we change our product mix. And so that should be reflected in the CECL calculation. And unfortunately, sometimes the CFOs and the accounting folks that are doing CECL are the last ones to know. So I would probably be proactive in a couple areas. Discussion with board and management, thinking carefully about your portfolio, your risk profile, and what's happening in the economy, being a student even more on the media coverage and the factors that are being published, and then making sure that you are in the loop with any changes in the portfolio. So those are just some things to think about. I think people are generally applying CECL, doing pretty well. We're understanding how to do that. Now the next challenge, I think, is as the economic situation changes, we're going to have to be a little bit fluid and make some adjustments in our approach. Does that make sense, Sean?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's a really subtle shift that, feels difficult to grasp, right? That the expectations of looking forward, pulls that into our Q factors, and then as experience happens, we might lower our Q factors, right? I think that's a concept that's probably seems foreign to a lot of us, but is really, as you mentioned, how CECL is supposed to work. And so, I think we'll get more comfortable with it and work through it. But I think your point around, being sensitive to underwriting and product changes, and as much information as you can to continue to support any of those changes, is great advice for everybody on the call today. Steve, anything you want to add there before we move on?
Nope.
Okay. All right. So now it's Steve's turn. So increasingly, what we've tried to do on some of these coffee talks is incorporate some of the data and industry average information and put it into something that you can use and hopefully, again, kind of be directional about, or just get a sense of where things are and where things may be going. So Steve's put together some slides for us this morning, and I'm going to let him talk through those.
Yeah. First, this is one that we've shown on the last, I believe, for the first time with credit union data on the last coffee talk. It's a little bit more finalized now for the first quarter. Now that we have that completely behind us, I believe last month it was still in a little bit of flux given the timing of the coffee talk that we had during the filing period. But this is a result of the thousands and thousands of segment level user scenarios that our CECLSolver users have run. We wanted to give you some sort of a resource that you could use to see of all of our users, what kind of warms on average are they using by segment over time? How is that changing? Where directionally are the warms headed? And qualitative factor adjustments. Keep in mind, Q factor adjustments are relative to your historical lifetime loss rate. So really the most helpful part of this right here is going to be directionally focused, right? Are Q factor adjustments more generally positive? Are they getting larger? Have they become negative? Are they getting lower? Those are the types of trends to be kind of looking out for here that can help you to compare your experience to what everyone else is doing, keeping in mind that this data is not something you'll see anywhere else, right? None of this is in the public record anywhere at the segment level. So we thought it would be particularly helpful and useful to share with all of our users now that we have so many of you out there. And then finally, the ACL trends as well at the segment level. And what you can see is, if you go to the next slide, this is all the non-commercial, and the second slide is all the second half, all the commercial loans. A little bit less data in this half of it, obviously, for your typical credit union, but still data in there as well. And we've seen kind of reserves had jumped a little bit at the beginning of right when CECL became a law of the land, from the fourth quarter of 2022 to the first quarter of last year, and then they've sort of come up a little bit and leveled out. And if you go to the next slide, I believe, oh, no, this is not that. This slide is interesting. We had given you guys some data in the past as far as unfunded commitments were concerned, right? ACL levels for your unfunded commitments, because while our CECLSolver tool provides you with a module to help you get started in calculating a reserve for the unfunded commitments, that's a very new piece of the puzzle for most credit unions. That's not a value that was on your Form 5300s until CECL. But now that it is, and our tool provides it, I think, what was it? I don't remember. Did we say 72% of the on our question on our poll at the beginning? 72% of you guys on the call are calculating some sort of reserve on your unfunded commitments. Well, nationwide, only 13% of the credit unions in the United States have put something other than zero for their unfunded commitment reserve on the liability side of their balance sheet. So I assumed we'd have more uptake amongst our users since we provide a module to help you with it. But that's a pretty stark contrast between those two. So a lot of you are doing that, and that's great. If you look at median reserves for unfunded commitments, what are you going to find? You're going to find zeros across the board. Why? Because 87% of the credit unions out there are putting zero. Well, what about the credit unions that aren't putting zero? So for the 13% of credit unions, like most of you out there, who are plugging in or calculating something other than zero, median levels of reserves on unfunded commitments to total unfunded commitments is at about 5 basis points. 75th percentile is only at about 14 or 15 basis points. So even the credit unions, like 72% of you guys who are doing that, are still being pretty conservative with those reserve calculations. Paul, what do you think about those numbers?
I'm wondering if part of the disconnect with 87% reporting zero and our response that are you calculating and 72% say they are, is that there may be credit unions or folks on the call that are saying, yes, I'm doing a calculation. That calculation is either zero or I'm including it in my ACL and just not breaking it out on the call report. So there we may need to continue to watch this trend.
Certainly,
and throw it in there. But I would suggest that it's becoming, when CECL first came out, there was a lot of people that it seems like collectively rolled their eyes and said, I don't want to have to do that. I don't lose money on commitments. And over time, we've seen for all financial institutions, there's been a move to, okay, well, I'll throw something in there. And I would even suggest that perhaps the ones that have not done anything about unfunded are increasingly going to be asked about it. Like, why aren't you? Everybody else is, or everybody else. Most people seem to be moving in the direction of having something, but it's obviously not a very material number. You can see there that the ones that are reporting it, it's less than 20 basis points. It's a pretty small number. So I think there might be continue to be folks that just feel like it's not material, and so either don't record anything or include it in concept. It's in the ACL. It's like ragu. It's in there. You remember those commercials from years ago? I just showed my age there a little bit. So I think the jury's still out on us being able to really get some real good information. But I got to tell you, Steve, this is very helpful, though, to take out the zeros and look at the median for the folks that have something. I think that's a little bit more meaningful. If you're going to record something, it's probably good to know, well, what's everybody else recording that are actually recording something.
Well, you've heard about the 1%ers. This is the 0%ers, the non-zero percenters.
That's right.
Well, and I think too, and I think the next couple comments in the chat, are reflective of this. Just even probably, a lot of the lending mix might. So Catherine put in here, NCA reviewed all our disclosures for unfunded commitments, and it was noted that only our HELOC products required a reserve. And so, if you're not doing a ton of,
Oops, I think we lost Sean there for a
I
minute.
didn't know who we lost. We lost me or Sean.
Oh,
Okay, you're back, Sean.
I'm back. Yeah,
Sean,
we
you just
might,
froze for a minute.
Yeah,
sorry, that depending on what your mix is, you just may not have a lot of unfunded. And so Catherine's kind of about, HELOCs are probably the one areas where credit unions might have it. And then John's comment was on unfunded, would this be reflective of the majority of these are unconditionally cancelable, which again, certainly could be. So there may be a little bit of a different dynamic just on the lending mix where
Yeah,
credit unions might not have as much exposure to this, or the expectation is not as high for a reserve here.
Yeah, well, we typically see that that the HELOCs are not considered from an accounting standpoint to be unconditionally cancelable. For there have been multiple definitions of unconditionally cancelable that have been
Yes,
around
there
in the
have been.
past. The regulatory definition from a risk-based capital standpoint historically was more lenient. The more current accounting threshold for it seems to be more strict. And so we found that typically HELOCs have not been able to be considered unconditionally cancelable. Unused credit card lines are kind of the definition of unconditionally cancelable. So that's pretty confident that those can be in the unconditionally cancelable bucket, as well as overdrafts and some other lines like that. So depending upon your particular types of unfunded commitments, there may be a lot more or a lot less potential risk once you factor in unconditionally cancelable and estimated probability of funding, right? If you have some of these commitments out there that you just don't, there's just not a lot of uptake, it's something that people are taking for safety and they're not really using very much of that funds, it becomes pretty negligible from a risk standpoint.
Yeah. Agreed. All right. So Steve, next up for you. Let me just see if there's another chat in here. We had an examiner, quote unquote, make us get a legal opinion that our disclosure was written in a way that truly supported unconditionally cancelable. It feels a bit extreme, but I can't say I'm completely surprised. I would hope
to be honest, that kind of questioning or credible challenge, if you will, on what is or is not cancelable and what should be considered for reserve is why a lot of institutions are just saying, never mind, I'm not going to argue.
Yeah.
And I'll just put something in the reserve. So 10 to I've seen as high as maybe 30 basis points. Folks just say, I don't have a problem throwing a reserve up there. I don't personally think I need it, but it's not worth the argument. And so there's a discussion that you don't have to have those arguments if you just take your commitments and put some kind of reserve on it.
And
so
keep in mind that
it's
pro-cyclical to do so. If you put a reserve on an unfunded commitment that you expect has a decent likelihood of being funded, once that loan is funded, you already have reserve for it, right? You've front loaded it, so to speak. And so when it becomes a loan, you transfer reserve from the liability side of the balance sheet to your ACL. So it's really not making things worse on a permanent basis. It's to add some to the unfunded reserve. It's really just kind of a way of front loading the ACL, if you think about it that way.
Yeah. All right, Steve, next slide is yours.
Yeah, so this was I used our Excel add-in tool here to pull a bunch of reserve trends for credit unions around the country. I chose NCUA Peer Group 5. That's the $100 to $500 million credit unions. There's just over 1,000. I think, just around 1,100 of them currently, and wanted to show those trends so you can see from the public data. This is not from our universe of internal CECLSolver users. This is just all of the credit unions in Peer Group 5 around the country and their reported ACLs from their call reports over the last 5 quarters, right? And so you can see that reserve jumped up from 50 basis points, median from 50 to 62 basis points at the onset of CECL, and has trickled up from 62 up to 70 by the end of last year, and has been since flat at 70 basis points. And the mean, or the average, has shown a very similar trend. So we thought that might be helpful just to see kind of where the reserves are trending for the industry as a whole, not only at the average or median level, but also at the 25th, 75th, to give you kind of a little gap over time that you can track directionally. The next slide is new as well. This is where we're showing delinquent loans. So got a little bit of that in there. Foreshadowing over the same period for the same NCUA peer group 5, tracking something a little bit upstream. So if you're looking for a metric that you can use to justify an increasing qualitative factor adjustment, or just trying to get a leading indicator of the direction of potential credit quality, delinquent loans show up on the call reports, obviously, well before charge-offs do. So this is a way to do that. Now, just like with charge-offs, we still see some sort of seasonality with delinquent loans calculations. They tend to max out at the end of the year, and they tend to come down a little bit towards the beginning of the year for a multitude of reasons. And so the best way, in my opinion, to compare this is to track it over the course of a year, and then track the first quarter of a year versus the first quarter of the previous year. So if you look at those little trend lines there on the right, you'll see first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter of last year, and then a dip in the first quarter. But this year's first quarter significantly higher than last year's first quarter from a total delinquency standpoint. So new piece of information, also coming directly from our database in the Excel add-in. Paul,
Great.
Sean?
No, I think that's really helpful. Again, we want to be directional. This certainly, suggests an indication, of again, nothing severe, but certainly, degradation of some credit quality. So,
Yeah.
I think directionally that's oftentimes the best we can do when we forecast. Trying to be overly precise is often, not always worth the juice isn't worth the squeeze, but being directionally informative here is helpful. So I think this is great. All right. I don't know if there's any additional questions or chat in the coming, but if you do want to go ahead and submit those, again, just a little bit of plug for Saltmarsh. If you are looking for a validation, Paul's firm certainly can help. You certainly have to give him some lead time, but we did want to give him a shout out because he is familiar with our tool. So we'll put that out there. Increase. Paul, did you want to say anything?
Thanks, Sean. Just want everybody to know there's lots of great firms out there that are doing model validation, and we certainly do enjoy working with you and your team, and would be happy to help or be a sounding board for any of your clients that would like to just talk through what that process looks like and what we're seeing.
Great. Thank you, Paul. Again, just trying to incorporate as much knowledge and share as much information as we can, so we continue to expand out the YouTube page. We have the knowledge base tab on our CECLSolver, where you can find some of the information that Steve had reported here today. We'll be back next month with another edition of Coffee Talk. Certainly appreciate everybody's participation today with the polling questions, the chat, and the questions. Steve or Paul, any final words before we let our group here get to their weekend?
You got a question there?
Yep. What are the most commonly used Q factors by peer group 5 and average basis point of Q factors?
Well, if you scroll back to the first data slide that we had there, I can talk to the levels of qualitative factor adjustments that we're seeing. So that the center third there is our median qualitative factor adjustments. Now, keep in mind, it's difficult to look at any of those values on an absolute basis because they are relative to their modifiers to your historical lifetime loss rate, right? If you have a WARM of 2 years, and so you have a lifetime loss rate of 1% over a 2-year period, that a 0.1, a 10 basis point Q factor adjustment is going to be 10 basis points relative to the 1% you had historical over that 2-year warm. So that's the better way to think of those qualitative factor adjustments is, again, looking for direction and looking for general size of it relative to the lifetime historical loss rates. But we can see that certain segments that have almost no losses historically tend to have obviously higher qualitative factor adjustments, and vice versa. But that's something that Paul alluded to earlier, is the interplay between historical experience and qualitative factors is a dynamic one. When you have a loss, when you incur a loss, and I see this all the time where an institution comes and says, hey, we just had, we had a problem with one particular relationship, and we finally recognized the loss there that we had anticipated for a long time. Our historical, now my ACL has gone through the roof. And they said, well, because that loss that you now recognize is now sitting in your historical experience. So your historical lifetime loss rate has gone way up, but they haven't looked at the other half of the equation. They haven't adjusted the Q factor down. And so if half of your Q factor was the expectation of a potential loss in this credit, and now you've realized that loss, it should no longer be a Q factor, right? Because it's now been realized. It's now been shifted to the history side of the equation. And so I encourage everyone to think of your losses from that perspective. If a loss was expected, that's what CECL is, current expected credit losses, then it should not have any significant impact on your reserve, as long as that expectation was shown as a Q factor before and is now shown as a historical loss on the other side. So I know that's not a direct answer to the question, but that's a way that we should all be thinking about qualitative factors. As far as what specific types, not levels, but types of Q factors institutions are using, obviously economic Q factors are a huge part for the vast majority of institutions, and peer-based, making a qualitative factor adjustment based not just on an economic index and a projection of the economic index moving forward, but also looking at the direction of where your peers have been headed, other institutions like you in your neighborhood, and where their losses have been recently and what direction they're headed in or have been headed in versus yours. That's a very common way and a helpful way to if you're looking for for Q factors. Everything outside of those relatively universal ones are going to be very specific to your institution. If you've had a stable management team over years, you're probably not going to have a significant Q factor adjustment from a management team perspective. If your loan portfolio, if the way it's constructed is stayed pretty similar and your business model stayed pretty similar, then you're not going to have an adjustment there. Same thing with underwriting standards and whatnot. The types of Q factor adjustments that you can have are really unchanged from how they've been for years and years in the old methodology, right? The suggested ones that we have on the CECLSolver come from 2004 interagency guidance, where all the regulators, including the NCUA, sat down and gave a list of the 7 or 8 or 9 different types of Q factors that at least need to be considered when making an accurate reserve calculation. But beyond that, I don't have much else on that.
Okay. All right. If there aren't any further questions, Paul or Steve, again, anything to share before we let them go?
No, just wanted to commend y'all for the tools that you're putting in place. It's very helpful for auditors and examiners to be able to use and look back at that. And I would encourage all the folks listening to periodically look at those averages that Steve just went through, to be able to sort of support that you're within a reasonable range, and to use that, quite honestly, to sort of second guess or think about whether your adjustments need to be a change. So we're not saying that those averages have to be the ones you use, but it is nice to know what the trend is and what the median levels are for others, to give you a sense of context, since we don't have years and years of experience with this. We are looking at that over a relatively short, just last couple of years. So we're looking at that for a relatively short period of time. So those tools are very helpful. Thank you for putting those in, and thanks for letting me join the conversation today.
Absolutely.
Always. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Steve. Thanks everybody for participating. We'll be back next month. Hope everyone has a great day and great weekend. And again, thanks to Paul Allen for joining us today. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.